The first light of dawn painted Blackridge Hollow in shades of gray and gold, but Sheriff Ed Carter felt no warmth as he stepped out of his patrol car. The mist clung to the mountains like a shroud, muffling sound and distorting distance. It wasn't unusual for the fog to linger here. It was part of what made this remote Appalachian town so hauntingly beautiful. But today it carried an oppressive weight that pressed on his chest. Ed had been sheriff for 20 years, long enough to know every face in Blackridge Hollow by name. Yet this morning, something was wrong. As he drove through the quiet streets, there were no children playing outside, no dogs barking, no smoke curling from chimneys. He knocked on doors, shouted greetings, even peered through windows into homes where breakfast tables remained set, coffee cups half full, and fires still crackling in hearths. But not a soul stirred. Panic began to creep up his spine when he reached Mabel Harper's house at the edge of town. Mabel was one of the oldest residents, her mind ravaged by dementia, yet she rarely missed a day sitting on her porch, knitting or humming old hymns. Today, however, her door stood ajar, and inside Ed found her huddled in a corner of her kitchen, clutching a worn quilt around her frail shoulders. "Mabel," he said gently, crouching beside her. "What happened?" Her milky eyes darted toward him, unfocused but filled with terror. "They're still here," she whispered hoarsely. Then louder, more insistent, "It was time." Ed tried to coax more information from her, but Mabel only muttered fragments, names he didn't recognize, dates decades past, and eerie phrases about the bargain and the debt. Her words sent chills down his spine, though he couldn't explain why. By noon, state investigators arrived, led by Detective Rachel Monroe. A sharp-eyed woman with silver-streaked hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, Rachel had built a reputation in solving cold cases across Virginia. This assignment intrigued her, not because she believed in ghosts or curses, but because the circumstances mirrored an unsolved disappearance from 30 years ago in Pinecrest Valley, another isolated mountain community. That case had haunted her career, and now fate seemed determined to drag her back into the shadows. Rachel surveyed the scene methodically. Abandoned cars, untouched meals, clocks frozen at 3:17 a.m. She listened patiently as Ed recounted Mabel's cryptic mutterings, jotting notes without comment. When she finally spoke, her voice carried both authority and doubt. "There's always a rational explanation," she said firmly. "Mass hysteria, environmental factors, maybe even foul play. We'll find it." But deep down, Rachel knew better than to dismiss anything outright. These mountains held secrets older than anyone alive could remember, and sometimes those secrets refused to stay buried. As Rachel settled into her investigation, the oppressive atmosphere of Blackridge Hollow began to seep into her bones. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles, heavy with the scent of decay. Shadows stretched unnaturally long under the weak sunlight, filtering through the dense canopy of trees. Even the birdsong seemed muted, as if nature itself hesitated to disturb the silence. She visited the local diner, Hopewell's Cafe, hoping to piece together a timeline of events from security footage. The owner, Walter "Hop" Hopewell, greeted her warily. His usual cheerfulness was gone, replaced by a hollow look of grief and fear. "They all just vanished," Hop muttered, handing over the memory card from his camera. "One minute, folks were sipping coffee, chatting about the weather. Next thing I knew, the place cleared out like someone flipped a switch." Rachel reviewed the grainy footage later that evening. At precisely 3:16 a.m., the screen showed patrons mid-conversation, forks raised, laughter echoing faintly. Then at 3:17, everything stopped. People froze, their faces blank, before walking calmly out the door without coats, wallets, or keys. No panic, no struggle, just obedience to some unseen force. Back at the station, Ed joined her, pouring 2 cups of bitter black coffee. "You think they're alive?" he asked quietly, breaking the tense silence. "I don't know yet," Rachel admitted, "but whatever this is, it's bigger than either of us." Meanwhile, Rachel spent hours trying to extract coherent details from Mabel Harper. Despite her dementia, Mabel occasionally lapsed into lucidity, recounting snippets of folklore and personal memories that hinted at something sinister beneath the surface. "They came last night," Mabel murmured one afternoon, staring out the window at the swirling mist. I heard them whispering, calling my name. Who came, Mabel? Rachel pressed gently. The ones who watch, Mabel replied cryptically. They've always watched, always waited. When Rachel probed further, Mabel grew agitated, clutching her quilt tighter and rocking back and forth. Don't you see? It was time. Every 50 years they take their due. And we promised. This mention of a promise piqued Rachel's interest. She began researching Blackridge Hollow's history, poring over dusty archives stored in the basement of the town hall. What she found chilled her to the core. Buried among yellowed newspapers and crumbling journals was a recurring theme. Disappearances occurring every 5 decades, each marked by strange weather patterns and widespread unease. One article from 1923 described how an entire congregation vanished during a midnight service, leaving behind only flickering candles and overturned hymnals. Another from 1873 told of miners abandoning their tools and marching silently into the woods, never to return. Most disturbing of all was a handwritten ledger detailing a bargain struck between the town's founders and an unnamed entity. The terms were vague, something about protection from hardship in exchange for periodic sacrifices, but the implications were clear. Blackridge Hollow hadn't simply grown in isolation. It had thrived under conditions too perfect to be natural. As Rachel closed the ledger, her hand trembled slightly. For the first time in her career, she wondered if logic alone would be enough to unravel the mystery of Blackridge Hollow. That night, as Rachel prepared to leave the station, she noticed the mist thickening outside, creeping closer to the building despite the lack of wind. Through the window, she thought she saw shapes moving within the fog, shadowy figures standing unnaturally still, watching. She blinked and they were gone. Back at her motel room, Rachel poured herself a stiff drink and stared at the files spread across her desk. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the thin walls, a low hum vibrated through the air, a sound like voices whispering in unison. It was time, Mabel had said. Time for what? And who or what was coming next? Rachel spent hours poring over the old records in the town hall basement, her mind racing as she connected the dots between the settlers' arrival and the eerie pattern of disappearances every 50 years. The Journal of Ezekiel Harrow provided a chilling glimpse into the founding of Blackridge Hollow, but Rachel knew she needed more evidence to confirm the connection between the settlers' bargain and the current vanishing. She discovered a series of newspaper clippings from the late 1800s that documented strange occurrences in the months following the settlers' arrival. One article described how livestock went missing overnight, only to reappear days later with no explanation, except for peculiar burn marks on their hides. Another recounted how several townsfolk reported hearing whispers in the woods, voices that seemed to call their names but vanished when they turned to look. The most disturbing clipping was an interview with a Cherokee elder named Running Elk, who had warned the settlers against claiming the land. According to the article, he spoke of the Watchers, ancient spirits said to inhabit the misty peaks and valleys of the Appalachians. These mountains are alive, Running Elk reportedly said. They give life, but they demand respect. If you take without giving back, if you break your promises, the Watchers will come for what is theirs. Rachel noted that the article ended abruptly, with no follow-up interviews or further mentions of Running Elk. It was almost as though someone had deliberately silenced him or erased his warnings from history. As Rachel delved deeper, she found references to periodic rituals performed by the settlers to appease the Watchers. These rituals were described in vague terms, often dismissed as superstitious nonsense by outsiders. However, one particularly detailed account stood out. A first-hand report from a traveling preacher who visited Blackridge Hollow in 1893. The preacher wrote about witnessing a midnight ceremony near Widow's Walk, the same grove Rachel would later explore. He described townsfolk gathering beneath an ancient oak tree, leaving offerings of food, herbs, and small animals. They sang hymns in low, mournful tones, their faces pale and drawn. It was not worship I saw, the preacher wrote. It was fear. Fear of something older than God, older than man, something that demanded payment for sins unspoken. Rachel felt a chill run down her spine as she read those words. She realized that the settlers hadn't just made a simple promise. They had entered into a covenant, binding themselves and their descendants to forces they barely understood. Piecing together these fragments, Rachel began to see a clear pattern. Every 50 years, the Watchers returned to collect their due. Sometimes it was crops or livestock. Other times it was something far more sinister. The disappearances Rachel was investigating weren't random. They were part of this cycle, a grim reminder of the debt owed to the mountain spirits. But why now? And why had Mabel been left behind? Rachel suspected that the answer lay in the terms of the original bargain. Perhaps the settlers had failed to uphold their end of the agreement, angering the Watchers and prompting them to take drastic action. Or maybe the debt had grown too large over 2 centuries, requiring a greater sacrifice than ever before. That night, as Rachel reviewed her notes, she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The mist outside her motel window thickened unnaturally, curling around the edges of the glass like smoke. She heard faint whispers carried on the wind, though she told herself it was just her imagination. Still, she couldn't ignore the sense of being watched. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the thin walls, something waited, patient, ancient, and hungry. As Rachel and Ed continued their investigation, they began conducting thorough searches of the abandoned homes in Blackridge Hollow. The eerie stillness of the town weighed heavily on them, but it was the small details that truly unsettled Rachel. Details like the strange symbols carved into door frames, mantels, and even furniture. At first glance, the markings seemed random, swirling patterns, jagged lines, and spirals etched deeply into the wood. But the more Rachel saw them, the more she realized they weren't haphazard doodles. They were deliberate, almost ritualistic. Some appeared freshly carved, while others looked centuries old, their edges worn smooth by time. The symbols weren't confined to one house or family. They appeared in nearly every home Rachel searched. In some cases, they were accompanied by scorch marks or stains that smelled faintly of herbs. One particularly striking example was found in the mayor's residence. A massive oak dining table inscribed with a spiral surrounded by jagged lines, identical to the symbol Jonas Whitaker had shown her on the animal hide map. Rachel photographed the symbols meticulously, cataloging their locations and noting any accompanying anomalies. She noticed that the carvings often appeared near thresholds, doorways, windows, and fireplaces, as though meant to guard against something trying to enter or leave. Determined to understand the meaning behind the symbols, Rachel consulted Jonas Whitaker again. When she showed him the photographs, his expression turned grave. "These aren't just decorations," he said, tracing one of the images with a trembling finger. "They're warnings, or maybe prayers. I've seen these before, but not in books or records. They're on the cave walls up in the mountains." He explained that local legend spoke of caves hidden deep within the forest, places where the Watchers were said to dwell. Generations ago, brave souls would venture into those caves to leave offerings or plead for mercy. Many never returned, and those who did claimed the walls inside were covered in similar markings. "They believed the symbols could hold the Watchers at bay," Jonas continued. "But there's another interpretation, one darker than protection. Some say these symbols are meant to imprison, to bind whatever lies beyond the veil." Rachel frowned. "You think the settlers used these symbols to trap the Watchers, or to keep themselves safe?" "Maybe both," Jonas replied cryptically. "But if the bargain has been broken, no symbol will save us now." To gain further insight, Rachel sent photos of the symbols to Dr. Evelyn Grant, an archaeologist specializing in indigenous cultures of the Appalachian region. Within days, Dr. Grant responded with astonishing findings. "These symbols belong to a long-lost tribe predating even the Cherokee," she wrote in her email. "We've only ever seen fragments of their art in remote caves, but oral traditions suggest they worshipped or feared entities tied to natural forces. The swirls represent cycles, perhaps seasons or lifetimes, while the jagged lines signify barriers or boundaries." Dr. Grant added a chilling postscript. "If these symbols have resurfaced in modern times, it means someone or something is invoking ancient powers. Be careful, Detective Monroe. These forces don't take kindly to interference." Armed with this knowledge, Rachel revisited the homes where the symbols had been found. Now she viewed them through a new lens. Were they placed as acts of devotion, desperate attempts to appease the Watchers, or were they meant to contain something far worse? In one home, she discovered a journal belonging to the resident, filled with frantic entries about dreams of shadowy figures watching from the woods. The writer described carving the symbols herself after hearing whispers in her sleep, convinced they would keep the dead away. Yet despite her efforts, the family had vanished like everyone else. Rachel couldn't help but wonder, had the symbols failed, or had they merely delayed the inevitable? That evening, as Rachel reviewed her notes, she noticed something unsettling. The symbols weren't just appearing in the homes, they were starting to appear elsewhere. On the walls of the town hall basement, etched into tree bark along the forest trails, even scratched faintly into the foggy windows of her motel room. Each time she saw one, the air around her grew colder, heavier, and always, just out of sight, she felt the presence of unseen eyes watching her. Whatever these symbols represented, they weren't enough to stop what was coming. If anything, they seemed to be drawing its attention closer. Mabel Harper remained the only living link to Blackridge Hollow's vanished residents, and Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that the elderly woman held vital answers buried deep within her fractured memories. Despite Mabel's dementia, Rachel persisted in visiting her daily, hoping to coax out fragments of the truth. One afternoon, as rain pattered against the windows of Mabel's small house, Rachel brought a photo album she'd found among the town records. It contained faded images of early settlers, including some who bore a striking resemblance to Mabel herself. She showed the pictures to Mabel, gently prompting her to talk about her childhood. At first, Mabel seemed confused, her gaze drifting aimlessly over the photos, but then her eyes widened, and she grabbed one image with surprising strength. "That's them," she whispered hoarsely. "My parents." Rachel leaned closer. The photograph depicted a young couple standing in front of an old cabin, their faces somber but resolute. Behind them loomed the dense forest, shrouded in mist. Something about the scene sent a chill down Rachel's spine. "They didn't die natural deaths," Mabel continued, her voice trembling. "They were taken because they knew too much." Over the next hour, Mabel's recollections came in fits and starts, disjointed yet hauntingly vivid. She spoke of growing up in Blackridge Hollow during the 1940s, a time when the town still whispered about the disappearances of 1923. Her parents, she said, had been keepers of forbidden knowledge, secrets passed down through generations about the bargain struck with the Watchers. "They hid things," Mabel muttered, clutching her quilt tighter. "Books, maps, symbols, all locked away in a chest beneath the floorboards. They told me never to speak of it, never to look inside. But I did." Rachel pressed gently. "What did you find?" Mabel hesitated, her milky eyes clouding with fear. "Names, dates, instructions for keeping the Watchers at bay, but also warnings. If anyone broke the rules, if anyone tried to leave without paying the debt, it would anger them." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "And my parents broke the rules." According to Mabel, her parents had attempted to flee Blackridge Hollow after realizing the true cost of the bargain. They feared for their daughter's safety and believed they could escape the curse by leaving the mountains behind. But the Watchers wouldn't let them go. "They came for us in the night," Mabel recalled, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. "I don't remember everything, just the sound of breaking glass, the smell of smoke. When I woke up, my parents were gone. The townsfolk said they died in a fire, but I knew better. I saw their faces in the mist afterward." After the incident, Mabel was sent to live with relatives in a nearby city. She rarely returned to Blackridge Hollow, even as an adult, fearing the pull of the mountains and the whispers that haunted her dreams. Yet now, decades later, fate had brought her back and left her alone in the eye of the storm. Rachel immediately recognized the significance of Mabel's story. If the chest described by Mabel still existed, it could contain crucial evidence about the nature of the bargain and how to break the cycle of disappearances. With Ed's help, Rachel searched Mabel's home, eventually uncovering loose floorboards near the hearth. Beneath them lay a rusted metal chest, its surface etched with the same strange symbols found throughout the town. Inside, they discovered a trove of artifacts: brittle handwritten journals, maps marked with ominous locations, bundles of dried herbs, and a leather-bound book filled with cryptic diagrams and incantations. One journal entry stood out, written in shaky handwriting: We cannot undo what has been done, but we can delay the reckoning. Leave offerings faithfully. Do not break the chain. Teach your children to honor the watchers, lest they turn their wrath upon us all. Another page detailed rituals performed every 50 years, including instructions for preparing sacrifices. The final entry was chilling. Tonight the debt comes due. May God have mercy on our souls. As Rachel examined the contents of the chest, Mabel grew increasingly agitated. You shouldn't have opened it, she muttered, rocking back and forth. They'll know. They always know. Rachel tried to reassure her, but the weight of the discovery settled heavily on her shoulders. The clues pointed to one undeniable conclusion. Someone in Blackridge Hollow had broken the rules this time. Whether through negligence, greed, or defiance, the bargain had been violated, and the watchers had responded in kind. But who and why? Outside, the mist thickened, curling around the edges of the window like grasping fingers. For the first time, Rachel felt certain that the watchers weren't merely spirits. They were hunters, and they weren't done yet. As Rachel and Ed continued their investigation, they noticed a disturbing new behavior in Mabel. Despite her dementia, she began spending hours each day obsessively drawing with trembling hands. At first, the sketches seemed like meaningless scribbles, random lines and shapes that might have been dismissed as the product of an unsteady mind. But soon a pattern emerged. Mabel's drawings depicted shadowy figures standing among the trees, their forms indistinct yet unmistakably human. They loomed silently, watching from the edges of the woods, their faces obscured by darkness. In some pictures, the figures appeared closer, almost stepping out of the forest. Others showed them surrounded by swirling mist, their outlines blurred as if they were part of the fog itself. When Rachel asked Mabel about the figures, the elderly woman froze, her pencil hovering mid-stroke. For a moment she seemed lost in thought, her gaze fixed on something only she could see. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "They're always there, the ones who wait." Rachel leaned closer, trying to keep her tone calm and gentle. "Who are they waiting for, Mabel?" Mabel didn't answer directly. Instead, she muttered fragments of phrases under her breath. "Not yet. Still time. They'll come when it's ready." Her eyes darted nervously toward the window, where the ever-present mist swirled ominously against the glass. Finally, she added, "They don't forget. Not ever." Over the next few days, Mabel's drawings became more detailed and more unsettling. She started adding symbols around the figures, identical to the ones Rachel had found carved into door frames and furniture throughout the town. Some sketches included what looked like offerings laid at the feet of the shadowy watchers. Bowls of fruit, bundles of herbs, even small animals rendered in stark detail. One particularly haunting image showed the figures gathered in a circle beneath the ancient oak tree Rachel had visited in Widow's Walk. In the center of the clearing stood a lone figure, a child, faceless and featureless, holding a lantern. Surrounding them were jagged lines radiating outward, as though the ground itself was cracking open. Rachel felt a chill run down her spine as she studied the picture. It wasn't just art, it was prophecy or warning. That evening, as Rachel sat beside Mabel, flipping through the growing pile of drawings, she decided to press further. "Why do they wait, Mabel? What are they waiting for?" Mabel stared at her blankly for a moment, then reached out and grabbed Rachel's wrist with surprising strength. Her grip was cold, her milky eyes wide with terror. "For us," she hissed. "For anyone who tries to leave. For anyone who breaks the promise." She released Rachel's arm and began rocking back and forth, muttering again, "It was time. They always take their due." Rachel glanced at the stack of drawings, her heart pounding. Each one told a story, not just of Mabel's fractured memories, but of something far older and darker. The watchers weren't passive observers. They were patient predators, biding their time until the moment was right. Later that night, as Rachel reviewed the drawings in her motel room, she couldn't shake the feeling that Mabel's visions were more than mere hallucinations. The figures in the sketches bore an uncanny resemblance to the shadows Rachel had glimpsed earlier in the woods, the same ones that seemed to watch her from the mist. She spread the drawings across the table, arranging them chronologically. As she did, she noticed something chilling. The shadowy figures grew larger and clearer with each successive image, as if they were drawing closer with every passing day. And then, in the final drawing, Mabel had scrawled a single word at the bottom of the page: now. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of whispers. Rachel turned toward the window, half expecting to see the figures staring back at her through the glass. Instead, there was only the swirling mist, thickening unnaturally despite the stillness of the air. But she knew. They were there, watching, waiting. As Rachel and Ed delved deeper into the mystery of Blackridge Hollow, they began to notice increasingly strange occurrences in the natural world. What started as subtle anomalies quickly escalated into undeniable signs that something unnatural was happening, something tied to the land itself. One morning, Rachel stepped outside her motel room to find the air eerily silent. Normally, the forest was alive with the sounds of birdsong, rustling leaves, and distant animal calls. But today, there was nothing, just an oppressive stillness that seemed to press down on her chest. When she mentioned it to Ed, he nodded grimly. "It's not just here," he said. "All over town, people have noticed the wildlife disappearing. Deer, rabbits, even squirrels. They've all vanished. Whatever scared them off must have been bad." Rachel recalled Mabel's warnings about the ones who wait, and couldn't help but wonder if the animals had sensed danger long before humans did. If so, what did that mean for those left behind? Later that day, while driving along the outskirts of town, Rachel spotted a frantic flock of crows circling above the woods. Their cries were sharp and discordant, unlike anything she'd ever heard. As she watched, the birds suddenly scattered, fleeing toward the horizon as though pursued by some unseen force. Another unsettling phenomenon became apparent as Rachel ventured deeper into the woods. Despite the mild autumn weather, certain areas grew unnaturally cold, so cold that her breath fogged in the air and frost formed on the ground overnight. These pockets of freezing temperatures appeared without warning, often accompanied by an overwhelming sense of dread. At Widow's Walk, where Rachel had previously found the ancient oak tree and scorched earth, the chill was particularly intense. She could feel it seeping through her jacket, biting at her skin like icy fingers. When she knelt to examine the ground again, she noticed fresh frost forming around the edges of the blackened circle, a stark contrast between fire and ice. Ed shivered beside her, pulling his coat tighter. "This ain't normal," he muttered. "Not this time of year. Feels like, I don't know, like something's sucking the life out of the place." Rachel didn't respond, but she agreed. The unnatural cold wasn't just a weather anomaly, it felt deliberate, as if the land itself was reacting to whatever presence lingered nearby. Perhaps the most ominous sign was the thick fog that rolled in regardless of conditions. Meteorologists reported no explanation for the dense mist blanketing the mountains. Humidity levels were low, and wind patterns shouldn't have allowed such a rapid buildup. Yet every evening, as dusk fell, the fog descended upon Blackridge Hollow like a living thing. Locals referred to this phenomenon as the veil lifting, a phrase whispered with equal parts reverence and fear. According to Jonas Whitaker, the term originated from old folklore describing moments when the boundary between worlds grew thin. During these times, the watchers could move freely among the living, or drag unsuspecting souls back with them. Rachel experienced this firsthand one night when she returned to the town hall basement to review documents. As she worked, the lights flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, swirling unnaturally despite the absence of wind. Then, faintly at first but growing louder, she heard whispers carried on the breeze, voices speaking in languages she didn't recognize. She rushed to the window and peered into the mist, her heart pounding. For a brief moment, she thought she saw figures moving within the haze, their forms indistinct yet unmistakably human. They stood motionless, watching her, and then, as suddenly as they appeared, they were gone. Back at her motel room, Rachel tried to piece together the significance of these environmental signs. The fleeing animals, the sudden drops in temperature, the thickening fog, all pointed to a convergence of forces beyond human understanding. It was as if the mountain itself was preparing for something monumental, something catastrophic. Mabel's words echoed in her mind. They're still here. Could the townsfolk have been taken because the watchers deemed them unworthy? Or was this part of a larger cycle, a debt that demanded payment every 50 years? Whatever the answer, Rachel knew one thing for certain. The veil was lifting, and when it fully parted, there would be no turning back. Rachel had spent days combing through the town hall archives, piecing together fragments of Blackridge Hollow's history. But it wasn't until she climbed into the dusty attic, a cramped space filled with forgotten relics and crumbling boxes, that she stumbled upon the most damning evidence yet. Hidden beneath a pile of moth-eaten quilts in an old cedar chest lay a leather-bound diary. Its cover was cracked and faded, but the name embossed on the front sent a shiver down her spine. Ezekiel Blackridge. As Rachel carefully opened the diary, the scent of aged parchment filled the air. Ezekiel's handwriting was spidery and uneven, betraying both his age and the weight of his conscience. From the first entry, it was clear that the founder of Blackridge Hollow carried a burden far heavier than she'd imagined. I write this not for absolution, for I know none shall come, but as a warning to those who follow. We have sinned greatly against the land and its rightful keepers. In our arrogance, we claimed what was never ours to take. Ezekiel recounted how he and the other settlers had ignored the warnings of the Cherokee people, dismissing their legends as superstition. They plowed sacred ground, felled ancient trees, and built their homes without regard for the spirits said to dwell within the mountains. When strange occurrences began, unexplained noises in the night, livestock disappearing, crops failing, they convinced themselves it was mere coincidence or trickery. But then came the bargain. In one chilling entry, Ezekiel described a desperate meeting held under the light of a blood moon. Faced with starvation and harsh winters, the settlers turned to an elder among them, a man named Silas Harlow, rumored to dabble in occult practices. Silas claimed to know how to appease the watchers, the unseen forces haunting the woods. We gathered at the edge of the forest, where the mist gathers thickest, Ezekiel wrote. Silas led us in chants I did not understand, calling upon names that chilled my soul. Then from the shadows they came, not visible, but felt. A presence colder than winter, older than time itself. It spoke not with words, but with whispers that seeped into our minds. According to the diary, the watchers agreed to spare the settlers, but at a cost. Every 50 years, the town would owe a debt, paid in offerings or sacrifices. Failure to comply would result in retribution. Ezekiel expressed deep regret over agreeing to the pact, admitting he hadn't fully understood its terms. We bargained with powers beyond comprehension, trading fleeting comfort for eternal bondage. Now we are bound to this place, unable to leave without consequence. The final entries in the diary were frantic, written in haste as though Ezekiel feared discovery. He urged future generations to honor the bargain, no matter how unjust it seemed. Do not break faith with the watchers, he pleaded. They are patient, but they do not forgive. Teach your children to fear them, to respect the rituals passed down. If you falter, if you forget, they will come for all of you. One passage stood out, highlighted by Ezekiel with heavy underlines. The debt is more than material. It is a reckoning for our sins, the betrayal of the land, the theft of sacred ground. Each generation must pay not only with goods or lives, but with acknowledgement of what we have done. To deny this truth is to invite ruin. Further reading revealed a darker secret. Ezekiel himself had played a role in escalating the settlers' debt. In a moment of weakness, he attempted to cheat the watchers by substituting lesser offerings instead of fulfilling the full terms of the pact. The consequences were immediate and devastating. They took Martha and little Samuel, he wrote, referring to his own family. I begged for mercy, but there is none. The watchers do not negotiate. They demand obedience. From that point on, Ezekiel lived in constant fear, haunted by guilt and the knowledge that his actions had doomed countless others. His final entry ended abruptly, as though he'd been interrupted or taken. Rachel sat back, her mind racing. The diary confirmed everything Mabel had hinted at and tied the disappearances directly to the settlers' original sin. But it also raised new questions. Had someone in the current generation repeated Ezekiel's mistake? Was the entire town being punished because of one person's hubris? Outside, the fog thickened unnaturally. Curling around the eaves of the town hall, like grasping fingers. Through the window, Rachel thought she saw movement in the mist. Shadowy figures watching silently from the woods. She quickly closed the diary, her hands trembling. As she descended the creaky attic stairs, she couldn't shake the feeling that the watchers already knew she'd uncovered the truth. And now, they were waiting to see what she would do next. As Rachel dug deeper into the mystery of Blackridge Hollow, the line between investigator and participant began to blur. The supernatural elements she'd initially dismissed as superstition or psychological stress grew impossible to ignore. Every step forward felt like stepping into a trap laid centuries ago. It started subtly, a faint whisper in an empty house that stopped the moment she turned her head. Shadows darting just beyond the edge of her vision, vanishing when she tried to focus on them. But soon the phenomena escalated. One evening, while reviewing files in the town hall basement, Rachel heard footsteps above her, slow and deliberate, though she knew she was alone. She called out, her voice trembling, but received no answer. Only silence heavy enough to suffocate. The forest surrounding the town became especially oppressive. Certain areas seemed alive with malevolence, the air thick and cold, as if the trees themselves were closing in. Whenever Rachel ventured too close to Widow's Walk or the caves Jonas had mentioned, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over her, forcing her to retreat. Once, deep in the woods, she swore she saw figures moving among the trees, their forms indistinct but unmistakably humanoid. When she shouted for them to show themselves, the only response was the sound of leaves rustling unnaturally, even though there was no wind. These experiences left Rachel shaken, but they also hardened her resolve. Whatever force was behind the disappearances, it wasn't content to remain hidden anymore. It was testing her and perhaps warning her. Mabel Harper, meanwhile, continued to surprise everyone with moments of startling clarity. Her dementia seemed to recede at odd intervals, allowing fragments of her past to surface with alarming vividness. During one such episode, Mabel recounted memories of winter solstice rituals performed by the townsfolk, a tradition passed down through generations. At first, the ceremonies were simple, offerings of food, herbs, and handmade crafts left beneath the ancient oak tree in Widow's Walk. Over time, however, the rituals grew darker, more desperate. Mabel described how participants would chant in low, mournful tones, invoking names she couldn't or wouldn't repeat. By the mid-20th century, the ceremonies involved animal sacrifices, and later, something far worse. They called it the offering, Mabel whispered, her voice trembling. Not everyone understood what it meant, but those who did, they chose someone. Rachel leaned closer, her heart pounding. Chose someone for what? Mabel hesitated, tears welling in her eyes. To give back, to pay the debt. Her words sent chills down Rachel's spine. If the townsfolk had selected individuals as part of the ritual, it suggested a level of complicity that went far beyond mere survival. Was this why so many had vanished? Had they willingly sacrificed themselves, or been forced to do so? Determined to find answers, Rachel expanded her investigation beyond Blackridge Hollow. Using resources from her department and tips from historians like Jonas Whitaker, she uncovered newspaper clippings detailing similar disappearances in other small towns across America. Each case shared eerie parallels, entire populations vanishing overnight, leaving behind untouched belongings and frozen clocks. More disturbingly, all these towns were located near ancient tribal lands, places sacred to indigenous peoples whose treaties had been broken during colonization. Rachel noticed a pattern. The disappearances occurred on significant anniversaries tied to those broken agreements. 50 years, 100 years, sometimes longer. It was as though the land itself remembered the betrayals and demanded restitution. One clipping stood out in particular. A journalist covering a disappearance in Pinecrest Valley, a case Rachel herself had investigated decades earlier, noted strange symbols carved into rocks near the site. The symbols matched those found in Blackridge Hollow, further linking the incidents to a shared supernatural force. Rachel realized the implications were staggering. This wasn't just about one cursed town. It was about a cycle of retribution spanning centuries. The Watchers weren't merely local spirits. They were guardians of justice, punishing those who violated sacred pacts with the earth. That night, as Rachel pieced together the evidence in her motel room, the atmosphere grew heavier. The fog outside pressed against the windows like a living thing, curling inward despite the closed glass. She heard whispers again, louder this time, speaking in languages she didn't recognize. They seemed to emanate from the shadows pooling in the corners of the room. Then came the knock at the door. Rachel froze, her hand hovering over her gun. Slowly, she approached the door and peered through the peephole. No one was there, but on the ground lay a single object, a blackened feather, identical to those found in the offerings beneath the ancient oak tree. She picked it up cautiously, her mind racing. The message was clear. The watchers knew she was getting close, and they were watching. Rachel sat at her makeshift desk in the dimly lit motel room, surrounded by notes, photographs, and artifacts collected over weeks of investigation. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made it hard to breathe. She stared at the blackened feather lying on the table before her, a grim token from the watchers, and felt the weight of everything she'd uncovered pressing down on her. It all came together in a sudden, horrifying flash of clarity. The disappearances weren't random acts of vengeance. They were deliberate, calculated punishments. Each generation of Blackridge Hollow had inherited the sins of their ancestors, the theft of sacred land, the betrayal of treaties, the desecration of holy sites. And every 50 years, the spirits demanded retribution unless the debt was acknowledged and repaid. Rachel thought back to Ezekiel Blackridge's diary, his guilt-ridden warnings echoing in her mind. "We bargained with powers beyond comprehension. Teach your children to fear them." The settlers hadn't just struck a deal for survival. They had bound themselves and their descendants to an ancient, unforgiving force. Every offering, every ritual, every sacrifice had been an attempt to delay the inevitable reckoning. But this time something had gone wrong. Perhaps the townsfolk had grown complacent, forgetting the true nature of the bargain. Or perhaps someone had deliberately broken faith, believing they could escape the curse. Whatever the reason, the Watchers had responded as they always did, with swift, merciless justice. Rachel's thoughts turned to Mabel, whose fragmented memories now seemed like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. The winter solstice rituals, the escalating darkness of the ceremonies, the offering, it all pointed to one chilling conclusion. The people of Blackridge Hollow hadn't simply vanished. They had been taken as payment for the debt. Not just any payment, but a blood price. Mabel's words haunted her. They chose someone. Rachel recalled the chest beneath the floorboards, filled with cryptic instructions and maps marked with ominous locations. One map stood out now, a spiral etched onto the parchment, leading to a place deep in the forest labeled only as the Hollow. It wasn't just a name, it was a destination, a gateway, a prison. She realized what she had to do. To save whoever might still be alive, and to end the cycle once and for all, she would have to confront the Watchers directly. She would have to acknowledge the debt and repay it. But how, and at what cost? Armed with the map, the symbols, and Mabel's fragmented insights, Rachel set out into the forest under the cover of night. Ed insisted on accompanying her, but she refused, knowing the journey ahead was hers alone. As she stepped into the mist-shrouded woods, the temperature plummeted and the whispers grew louder, swirling around her like a chorus of ghosts. The path was treacherous, marked by jagged rocks and gnarled roots that seemed to reach for her ankles. The deeper she ventured, the more distorted reality became. Shadows moved independently of their sources, trees twisted unnaturally, and the ground beneath her feet felt soft, almost spongy, as though the earth itself was decaying. Finally, she reached the hollow. It was a clearing surrounded by towering pines, their branches interlocking to form a canopy that blotted out the moonlight. At its center stood the ancient oak tree, larger and more menacing than she remembered. Its bark was scorched black, and its roots clawed outward like skeletal hands. Beneath it lay a circle of ash, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. And there, waiting for her, were the Watchers. They emerged from the mist slowly, their forms shifting between human and something far older. Their faces were obscured by shadow, but their eyes burned with cold, ancient fury. They didn't speak, not aloud, but their voices filled Rachel's mind, layered and discordant, speaking in languages she couldn't understand yet somehow comprehended. "You seek answers," they said, "but truth comes at a price." Rachel swallowed hard, forcing herself to stand tall, despite the terror coursing through her veins. "I'm here to pay the debt," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. "Tell me what you want." The watchers circled her, their movements silent but deliberate. Images flooded her mind, visions of the settlers' betrayal, the destruction of sacred lands, the suffering of those displaced and forgotten. She saw generations of townsfolk trying to appease the spirits with hollow gestures, their fear masking their denial. And finally, she saw the moment when the bargain was broken entirely, a defiant act of greed, arrogance, or ignorance that sealed the fate of Blackridge Hollow. "The debt is not yours to bear," the watchers intoned, "but you may choose to accept it." Rachel understood then. The disappearances weren't meant to punish indiscriminately. They were a call to accountability. By taking the townsfolk, the watchers sought to remind humanity of the consequences of their actions. But if Rachel took responsibility, if she acknowledged the sins of the past and offered herself as restitution, the cycle could be broken. Tears streamed down Rachel's face as she knelt before the ancient oak, placing her hands on the scorched earth. "Take me," she whispered. "Let the others go. Let this end." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ground beneath her began to quake, and the air grew impossibly cold. The watchers closed in, their shadows merging into a single, towering figure. Light erupted from the circle of ash, blinding and searing, and Rachel felt herself being pulled downward, into the earth itself. When the light faded, the clearing was empty. The mist lifted, revealing a sky streaked with dawn. Somewhere in the distance, birds began to sing again. Back in Blackridge Hollow, life slowly returned to normal. Or as close to normal as it could be. The townsfolk reappeared, dazed and disoriented, with no memory of where they'd been or what had happened. Only Mabel seemed to understand, her eyes filling with tears as she looked toward the forest. Rachel Monroe was never seen again. Some say she became part of the Hollow, forever bound to the Watchers as their guardian. Others believe she found peace, having paid the ultimate price to break the curse. As for Blackridge Hollow, the town remained quiet, its people wary but grateful. The lessons of the past lingered, etched into the land and the hearts of those who called it home. And though the fog still rolled in each evening, it carried no malice, only the faint echo of a promise kept. "Don't go," Mabel said firmly, gripping Rachel's arm with surprising strength. "It's not your debt to pay." Rachel hesitated, startled by the conviction in Mabel's voice. "What do you mean?" Mabel sighed heavily, her gaze drifting toward the window where the mist swirled unnaturally thick. "I stayed behind because I knew they'd take everyone else. This isn't about you. It's about me. About us." She gestured vaguely, as if encompassing the entire town and its history. "I've been talking to them," Mabel continued, her voice trembling but resolute. "The ones who wait. They told me. They've waited long enough. It's my turn now." Rachel stared at her, stunned. "Talking to them? How?" Mabel didn't answer directly. Instead, she reached into the folds of her quilt and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Unfolding it revealed a collection of items: dried herbs, a shard of obsidian, and a faded photograph of her parents, the same one Rachel had shown her days earlier. "They've always known I was here," Mabel whispered. "All these years I felt them watching, waiting. They let me stay because they wanted me to remember, to finish what my family started." Her hands trembled as she clutched the bundle tighter. "My parents broke the rules when they tried to run. Their blood is on my hands too. That's why I'm still alive. To make it right." Rachel tried to argue, to convince Mabel that she couldn't possibly shoulder this burden alone. But Mabel cut her off, her tone fierce despite her frailty. Rachel opened her mouth to protest, but the words caught in her throat. Mabel was right. The cycle wouldn't end unless someone stepped forward to acknowledge the sins of the past and bear the consequences. Tears welled in Mabel's eyes as she looked at Rachel, her expression both sorrowful and determined. "Tell them. Tell them we remembered. Tell them we paid the debt." Before Rachel could respond, Mabel turned and walked toward the door, her steps slow but steady. She paused briefly in the doorway, looking back over her shoulder. "They're still here," she murmured, "waiting for justice." Then she disappeared into the mist. Rachel followed at a distance, torn between stopping Mabel and respecting her decision. By the time she reached the edge of the forest, Mabel was already deep within the trees, guided by an unseen force. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as Rachel trailed behind, her heart pounding with dread. When she finally arrived at the hollow, the scene before her was both haunting and beautiful. Mabel stood beneath the ancient oak tree, her figure silhouetted against the glowing circle of ash. The watchers surrounded her, their shadowy forms shifting and merging like smoke. They loomed closer, yet Mabel showed no fear. Kneeling slowly, Mabel placed the bundle of offerings at the base of the tree. Her lips moved silently, muttering words Rachel couldn't hear, perhaps prayers, perhaps apologies. Then she raised her head, meeting the watcher's burning gaze without flinching. "It's done," she said aloud, her voice carrying a strange authority. "Take me. Let the others go. Let this place rest." For a moment, nothing happened. The air grew colder, heavier, until it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. Then the ground beneath Mabel began to crack, fissures spreading outward from the circle of ash. Light erupted upward, blinding and radiant, swallowing everything in its path. When the light faded, Mabel was gone. The watchers lingered for a heartbeat longer, their forms dissolving into the mist. And then, silence. Rachel stumbled backward, overwhelmed by grief and awe. As she made her way back to town, the oppressive weight that had settled over Blackridge Hollow lifted. The fog thinned, revealing a sky streaked with dawn. Birds chirped tentatively, and the scent of pine replaced the acrid tang of decay. In the days that followed, the townsfolk returned, bewildered but unharmed. Many claimed to have no memory of what had happened, while others spoke of dreams filled with swirling mist and shadowy figures. Only Rachel knew the truth, and she carried it quietly, sharing only fragments with those who asked. Mabel's sacrifice became legend, whispered among the townspeople like a sacred vow. Some said she had joined the Watchers, becoming their emissary to ensure the debt would never be forgotten. Others believed she had found peace, her soul finally free after a lifetime of guilt and fear. Blackridge Hollow remained, its people forever changed by what they had endured. The symbols carved into door frames and furniture were left untouched, reminders of the fragile balance between humanity and the forces that govern the land. And though the mountains still whispered secrets to those willing to listen, the voices carried no malice. Only the echo of justice served. Rachel stood in the hollow, her hands trembling as she clutched the bundle of items Mabel had entrusted to her before disappearing into the mist. The ancient oak loomed above her, its gnarled roots clawing at the earth like skeletal fingers. Around her, the air was thick with tension, the kind that made every breath feel labored and heavy. She knew what she had to do, but the weight of it terrified her. Mabel's fragmented instructions echoed in her mind. Symbols first, then the herbs, speak their names. It wasn't much to go on, but Rachel pieced together the ritual using what she'd learned over weeks of investigation. She spread out the relics she'd gathered from across Blackridge Hollow, the strange symbols carved into wood, bundles of dried herbs, shards of pottery, and even the blackened feather left at her door. Each item carried echoes of the town's history, remnants of the settlers' desperate attempts to appease the Watchers. Rachel began by tracing one of the spiral symbols onto the ground, with ash from the circle beneath the tree. Her movements were slow and deliberate, each line a prayer for forgiveness. As she worked, the whispers grew louder, swirling around her like a chorus of ghosts. They weren't hostile, not yet, but they pressed closer, watching, waiting. Next, she arranged the herbs in a pattern resembling the offerings described in Ezekiel Blackridge's diary. Sage, lavender, and something unidentifiable but pungent filled the air with an earthy scent. She lit a match and set the herbs ablaze, the flames flickering weakly against the oppressive darkness. Smoke curled upward, twisting into shapes that seemed almost alive. Finally, she took the shard of obsidian and pressed it into the center of the spiral, murmuring the names Mabel had whispered in her final moments. Names of those who had come before: Ezekiel, Silas, Martha, Samuel, and others Rachel didn't recognize but felt compelled to say aloud. With each name, the ground beneath her seemed to shudder slightly, as if acknowledging the weight of the sins being confessed. When the preparations were complete, Rachel stepped back and knelt before the makeshift altar. Her voice wavered as she spoke, addressing the watchers directly. "I don't know if you can hear me," she began, her words raw with emotion, "but I'm here to finish what was started, to pay the debt my ancestors refused to acknowledge, to honor the land they stole and the lives they destroyed." She paused, tears streaming down her face as she thought of Mabel's sacrifice, of the townsfolk taken without warning or explanation, of generations bound to a curse they barely understood. "I offer this, not as repayment, because nothing can undo what's been done, but as a promise to remember, to teach those who come after us the cost of betrayal. Please, let them go. Let this end." For a moment there was silence. The flames sputtered, and the smoke hung motionless in the air. Then slowly the ground began to quake. The whispers returned, louder now, layered and discordant, filling Rachel's mind with images of the past. Settlers carving sacred trees, rivers running red with blood, faces twisted in anguish. The visions overwhelmed her, forcing her to close her eyes as waves of guilt and sorrow crashed over her. When Rachel opened her eyes again, the world had changed. The oppressive atmosphere that had weighed on Blackridge Hollow for so long was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt almost holy. The fog lifted gradually, revealing a sky streaked with dawn. Golden light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows that no longer seemed menacing. The watchers lingered for a heartbeat longer, their forms dissolving into the mist. Their presence was neither approving nor condemning. It simply faded. The whispers ceased, leaving only the sound of birdsong and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Rachel remained kneeling for several minutes, her body racked with exhaustion, but her spirit lighter than it had been in weeks. She didn't know if the ritual had truly ended the curse or merely delayed it. But one thing was certain: the cycle had been broken, for now. As Rachel made her way back to town, the transformation was unmistakable. Life returned to Blackridge Hollow, tentative but hopeful. The townsfolk reappeared, dazed but unharmed, with no memory of where they'd been or what had happened. Only Ed and a handful of others seemed to sense that something monumental had occurred. Rachel shared fragments of the truth with those who asked, careful not to burden them with the full weight of what she'd witnessed. Mabel's name became a quiet legend among the townspeople, spoken with reverence and gratitude. Some believed she had joined the Watchers, becoming their emissary to ensure the debt would never be forgotten. Others thought she had found peace, her soul finally free after a lifetime of guilt and fear. In the weeks that followed, Rachel helped the townsfolk rebuild, guiding them gently toward healing. The symbols carved into door frames and furniture were left untouched, reminders of the fragile balance between humanity and the forces that govern the land. And though the mountains still whispered secrets to those willing to listen, the voices carried no malice. Only the echo of justice served. Blackridge Hollow endured, its people forever changed by what they had endured. For Rachel, the experience was both a reckoning and a redemption, a reminder that some debts demand more than payment. They require acknowledgement, humility, and hope. Days passed and search teams from neighboring counties arrived in Blackridge Hollow, combing through the town and surrounding woods for any sign of the missing residents. Despite their efforts, no trace of them was ever found. No bodies, no evidence of struggle, nothing to explain their sudden disappearance. The case remained unsolved by conventional standards, destined to join the ranks of other unexplained mysteries. Rachel filed her official report with meticulous care, omitting all mention of supernatural elements. She described the environmental anomalies, the fog, the temperature drops, the fleeing wildlife, but framed them as potential natural phenomena that might warrant further scientific study. Her superiors accepted the report without question, though some gave her knowing looks, as if sensing there was more to the story than she could or would say. Though she couldn't prove what had happened, Rachel felt a profound sense of closure. The oppressive weight that had settled over Blackridge Hollow during her investigation was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. As she packed up her belongings and prepared to leave, she glanced around the town one last time. It was quiet now, almost peaceful, but the scars of its history lingered in the symbols carved into doorframes, the ancient oak tree at Widow's Walk, and the stories whispered among the remaining townsfolk. Mabel Harper vanished shortly after the ritual, leaving behind only her drawings and a single handwritten note tucked beneath her quilt. The note was brief but heartfelt. "Thank you, Rachel, for helping me find my purpose. They are waiting no longer. Rest easy knowing we have made amends." The note raised more questions than answers, but Rachel chose not to dwell on it. Instead, she shared Mabel's final message with the townspeople, who interpreted it in their own ways. Some believed Mabel had joined the others, taken by the Watchers to serve as their emissary or guide. Others thought she had simply passed peacefully, her long-held guilt finally lifted, her soul free to rest. Her drawings became something of a shrine, displayed in the town hall alongside artifacts recovered from the settlers' era. To many, they served as both a warning and a reminder. The land remembered, and so must they. As Rachel drove away from Blackridge Hollow, the mist began to roll in once again, curling lazily around the edges of the road. In her rearview mirror, she caught a glimpse of shadowy figures standing silently among the trees, their forms indistinct yet unmistakably present. For a moment she considered stopping, to turn back, to confront them, but then she realized it wasn't necessary. For the first time she understood why Mabel had kept saying, "They're still here." They were guardians, judges, watchers, and they always would be. With a deep breath, Rachel focused on the road ahead, letting the shadows fade into memory. But even as she left Blackridge Hollow behind, she knew one thing for certain. The past never truly disappeared. It simply waited, patient and eternal, for those brave enough to face it.